The Poppy Playtime franchise has developed some very memorable characters and locations, but some of the final assets we are familiar with were much different than the original idea. Most of it is fun alternative versions, but some are actually kind of disturbing. I'm not going to talk about every single detail because I'm sure you have already seen a ton of videos about it. However, I do want to give some insight as to why some of the content was cut and what would have happened if it was used. Plus, there are a few things I was able to dig up that I don't think many people have seen. So let's take a look at some of the unused content from Poppy Playtime. Now, the game went through a bunch of different titles before landing on Poppy Playtime, and the game's premise was much different. It was almost called Tina Toy Time, and even before this, some of the titles were The Toy Game and Toy Story But Evil. Yeah, not very interesting titles, but you'll notice it was heavily themed around toys, and there is a reason for this, which brings us to the original idea for the game. This was titled Poppy Playhouse. In this version, we played as a small toy inside of a house, so this makes sense for the past titles to include toy. In a picture preview of this version, we are being chased by toy Huggy Wuggy inside a living room. As you can see, an objective was to collect 10 shards, and we also used a flashlight with a battery life. I'm not sure what the shards were used for, but I'm really glad that they weren't included in the final game. That being said, many of the other characters in the final game were also going to be included in this version as well. The story to this version was still similar to the current one, meaning the living toys were under control or manipulated by the prototype to turn evil. My interpretation of this is we were a toy that once lived in this house that left and somehow made it back. Although upon returning, things had changed and the toys were now evil. Therefore, it would be up to us to figure out what happened. I could see this being an interesting premise to a horror game. It also kind of reminds me of a twisted horror version of Toy Story, like the older title suggested. Now, considering how far into development this looks, I wonder why they ended up scrapping it. My guess is they wanted something more relatable, where you play as a human rather than a toy. This way, you would be able to put yourself in the shoes of the protagonist, and almost imagine yourself in that reality, ultimately making a more realistic horror game, compared to being a toy. Regardless, this would be a cool idea for a spin-off or something like that. Now, the very beginning of Chapter 1 was going to start out in a much different way. We were originally intended to actually drive our vehicle to the Playtime Co. factory. As you can see in one of these shots, it shows us sitting in our car with our hand on the steering wheel. I point this out because our body is something we have never seen in any of the chapters, so it's interesting that they almost included this. After driving up to the location, we were also supposed to walk in, so we could have had a nice outside look at the whole factory, which would have been awesome. The reason for this getting scrapped is unknown, however, I have a few ideas. Firstly, us driving in might have taken away the feeling of being trapped. The story of Poppy Playtime sort of presents us, the player, as trapped inside the factory. We are unable to leave, even if we wanted to, so I think by showing us outside, it would have taken that isolation feeling away. The only surroundings we have ever seen from the game are inside the factory. It creates a subconscious feeling of being stuck. The inside of the building is all we know. The second reason might have been because it just would have felt weird or out of place. Showing the human hand would have probably forced the devs to include it again, and hand animation can be annoying. So it was likely best to just remove it and only let us ever see the grab pack rather than our hand. This is further suggested considering in one of these shots of us outside, we are already holding the grab pack. And to be honest, a driving cutscene would have been cool, however, I think it also would have been unnecessary. Driving is a common way to start a game, so they probably wanted to stay away from it as it would have felt slightly cliche. How do you guys feel about this being an intro to the game? Would you have liked it, or would it have felt out of place? When inside the factory, there was actually going to be a mini game of Simon Says included in Chapter 1. We would need to play this in order to turn the power back on. There was even up to 599 levels. Obviously, we wouldn't have had to play that many times, but it just shows how insane the games were. There was also an audio for this mini game as well.
This message is being broadcasted using the factory's backup power system. To reactivate this facility's main power, you must play a game of Simon Says, because at Playtime Co., everything is fun. To play, memorize the color sequences on the screen, and enter the exact sequence on the buttons below. Wow, you are doing so well. Next is level 99. Next is level 599. Great job. Oh no. The color sequence you chose was incorrect. Try again. No. Choose the correct colors. Try again. No. Congratulations. You won this game of Simon Says. See you again soon.
Now, this minigame was likely turned into musical memory for Chapter 2, but it's interesting that they never chose to include this. I think it's because including this minigame in Chapter 1 would have interfered with the overall story of Poppy Playtime. The game station houses all of the games inside the factory, therefore it plays a huge role in the lore. So including a minigame outside of where the games were played would have felt weird or out of place. Like I said, they probably scrapped it, changed it up a bit, and used it for musical memory in Chapter 2. At the very beginning of Chapter 1, we are shown an old Poppy doll commercial. During this, we see shots to the assembly of the Poppy doll, but we have never seen this area in the factory. Well, that's because it was never included in the final version. There is an extremely unsettling room full of doll heads that they likely used for the commercial shots, but never actually put it into the game. This room is pretty creepy, so it's unfortunate that they never ended up using it. Why is this? Well, it's probably because they couldn't find a good way to implement it without it feeling forced. It would have been so creepy and disturbing to walk into a room where hundreds of doll heads are staring at you. I really wish they would have made this work, but who knows, maybe we will see something like this in Chapter 4. In the files of Chapter 1, there was an extremely unsettling photo of Huggy Wuggy that might look familiar. His whole face is blue and deformed to create an alternate version. They obviously never used this in Chapter 1, but it was eventually reused in Chapter 3 as the nightmare version of Huggy. I wanted to point this out because it was reused. This is an example of Mob Entertainment finding ways to use old content, which gives hope that maybe some of the more interesting stuff in this video will be given new purpose in upcoming chapters. That's just something to think about. There is also an old synopsis of Chapter 1 that was slightly changed for the final version of the game. This one reads, "You are an ex-employee of Playtime Co. 10 years ago, Playtime was the king of the toy manufacturing industry. One morning, feeling ill, you decide to take a sick day. The next morning when you show up for work, military vehicles guarded the outside of the buildings. Apparently, while you were out sick, every single person inside the factory vanished into thin air. Now, 10 years later, you're returning for a visit." Of course, they scrapped this and went with the more creative version of adding the mailed letter and VHS tape. I bring this up because they originally thought of mentioning the military, which is interesting because throughout the game so far, there really hasn't been any mention of law enforcement. You would think there would be, considering tons of people randomly went missing, but everything was just swept under the rug. It's theorized that this was because Playtime Co. had very strong connections with the government and people of power. Playtime Co. did in fact create the ability to transfer human souls, so I think a government body would like to know about this. Regardless, it's just a detail to keep in mind. The room we find Poppy in was originally going to be different. In this version, she was behind a blue cloth that was hanging from the ceiling rather than the glass case we saw her in. It's assumed as we enter the room, the cloth would have risen to reveal Poppy. It was never said why they changed this, but I have an idea as to why. Obviously, it's a lot more dramatic to reveal her stuck inside of a glass case. But remember the letter we received at the beginning of Chapter 1? Well, it's theorized that Poppy wrote this. However, she couldn't have if she was locked inside of the case. And that's the point. They want us to think she didn't write it. It would have been too obvious that she did write it if we found her outside of the case. I made a whole video talking about this theory. Regardless, maybe I'm overthinking it. The blue cloth could have just been a placeholder, who knows. Now, I'm not going to spend too much time talking about everything unused from chapter 2, because there is actually a video on Mob Entertainment's channel talking about the lost secrets, so I recommend checking out that video if you haven't already seen it. But I will talk about some of the most important parts and give some insight to them. PJ Pugapillar was originally called Cassie Cutie Pillar. Before the change, this character was completely finished, and she was even seen in the trailer for chapter 2. However, they thought that they could do a better job at creating a more unholy character by incorporating two living beings into one, thus giving us PJ Pugapillar, the combination of a dog and caterpillar. While this change does not drastically make a difference in the overall story, it does present Playtime Co. as more creative with their toy creations. Their whole identity is making toys that you have never seen before, and combining two beings is a perfect way to do that. So this change is perfect, and it just adds to the lore of the game. There was originally going to be a different opening to chapter 2. After freeing Poppy from her case, we were to follow her through hallways, leading us to the catwalks where Huggy fell. That would have included a 10-minute parkour sequence through the area. This was scrapped because chasing Poppy ended up being too comical for the atmosphere of the game, and a 10-minute parkour sequence added nothing to the story, as there was no mention or build up to Mommy Longlegs. So this was replaced with exploring Ludwig's office, and Poppy getting kidnapped by Mommy Longlegs to build up the threat of her. I bring this up because if it was included, it would have been a nice way to maybe show off more of Huggy's death area, like seeing his fur and blood on the catwalks and pipes, maybe even seeing his still body on the very bottom floor. Speaking of main antagonists, there was also an alternate version to introduce us to Mommy Longlegs. Now, I'm not going to show each one, but I do want to point out an important detail. Each version has bleeped out audio and covered text of a name or character. These introduction versions were never used, so obviously they don't really matter. But I think this name that was covered up is of the prototype. Why would his name be covered up? Well, it's never said, but I think it's because they didn't want us focusing on who the prototype was all throughout chapter 2. The main antagonist is Mommy Longlegs, so they wanted us only focusing on her. They of course saved his reveal introduction for the end of the game where we saw his hand. This caught everyone off guard, which made for a more memorable experience. That being said, there was also a different death scene for Mommy Longlegs. In the unused version, her head was actually pulled inside the grinder instead of her lower half. There were two reasons why they didn't use this. The first being that seeing her head being dragged away by the prototype would resonate a lot more with everyone, rather than just her body. This created a more dramatic experience for the player to remember. The second reason was because her head getting grinded up would have been too graphic, which might have caused the game to get an M rating, thus lowering the amount of people being able to play. Just think about what an M-rated Poppy Playtime game would have looked like. I can only imagine the graphic detail we might see. In chapter 3, there are a ton of unused assets and things like that. So just like for chapter 2, I'm only going to talk about some of the most interesting. There are plenty of videos out there that go over all of this in detail, so I recommend checking them out if you're curious. The first and most obvious thing I have to bring up is the unused duck ride. In the pool section of chapter 3, there is a duck ride behind one of the walls. The player would ride a duck and pull levers to progress through the area. In this unused ride, there are a ton of polished details around it that suggest this was likely almost finished before they pulled it from the chapter. I think this was going to be used as the original path to meet Dog Day. We would ride the duck and the mini critters would come out to try and attack us, but we would use the flare gun to scare them away just like in the chapter. Why wasn't this used? Well, probably because it was never finished in time. Or they just thought adding this ride would feel out of place or forced. I'm not entirely sure. Regardless, it's super cool. Maybe they include something like this in chapter 4. The last thing I want to talk about is Miss Delight. She has unused animations that are extremely unsettling. As you can see in the unused version, her upper half barely moves. To me, this is much creepier than the animation they ended up going with. They also changed the way she moves in general. She used to only move in darkness. However, in the final version of the game, she moves only when we are not looking. Why did they change this? I think it was because this made more sense for her lore. She would stand still to try and trick the other teachers into thinking she was dead, letting her get the upper hand and attack them. So this is what she is doing with us, standing still while we look at her in hopes that we think she is dead. This is why she moves when we are not looking. It's so she can attack us when we least expect it. It just adds to her lore and backstory. I know there is a lot of stuff I didn't talk about, but I wanted to point out what I thought was the most interesting unused content for Poppy Playtime so far and give my opinion on it. Which do you wish they would have included in the final game? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below, and if you like horror game content like this, please consider subscribing. Also, if you want to support the channel more, you can become a member. Don't forget to follow my Twitter at TerrifyT. Thanks for watching.